Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us today. We're really excited about this discussion, and we're really glad that you took a minute out of your day to join us. This is our webinar on protecting our waters and the new policies for data centers and large water users across the Great Lakes Basin. My name's Andrea Densham. I'm the Regional Director of Government Affairs at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. As many of you know, the Alliance for the Great Lakes for over 50 years has been working to protect our region's most precious resource, the fresh, clean, and natural waters of the Great Lakes, for today and for generations to come. Also, as many of you are aware, and probably why you're here today, data centers and the impact they're having not only on energy use, but also on water use and potential water pollution is an issue that is emerging across the entire Great Lakes region. From states from Ohio to Michigan to Wisconsin and here in Illinois. The Alliance for the Great Lakes is headquartered in Illinois, in Chicago. That's where I am today. And we have staff and experts across the basin located in different ones of our different regional states, different states in our region. And as you've been hearing, probably in your local newspapers or on your local radio or TV, the issue of data centers is increasingly a concern. It's a concern for local municipalities, but it's also a concern for states and at the federal level. You're hearing and seeing public policy move really quickly and lots of concern at the local level. We're going to begin to talk to you today a little bit about what those issues are, specifically through the lens of water. It's a lens that we haven't heard as much about. But before I pass it on to our content experts for them to give you a wonderful overview of the issue and how it's playing out here in Illinois, I wanted to highlight how critical of an issue this is for our region's consumers and citizens. Recent polling around the Illinois Power Act, an act that we have been working really hard to advance, shows that 70% of voters support the legislation to hold data centers accountable after hearing just a brief description about the bill. So before I hand it off, I just want to note that the Alliance has been working with our partners across the Great Lakes Basin to support and establish common sense guardrails and frameworks that support sustainable growth while ensuring thoughtful stewardship of the Illinois waters, to ensure that when we work on and data centers begin to establish themselves, that they're done so with transparency, accountability, as well as protections for communities and ecosystems to ensure that we don't have water overuse and that we prevent pollution. With that, I'm going to introduce Helena, who is here today to talk to you about the great work that she has done, including 2 publications on data centers and a playbook that just came out this year that some of you might have learned about. Helena does really important work here in our region, and I'm going to hand it over to her to give you a little bit more of an overview of her important work, and then to talk about the Alliance's vantage point when it comes to data centers.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, I'm Helena Volzer. I'm the Senior Source Water Policy Manager at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, based in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of kind of some of the water-related issues with data centers and in the Great Lakes. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Great, thank you so much. Let me get started here. So as Andrea mentioned, we have 2 publications out kind of regarding not only data centers, but large water use in general across the Great Lakes region. We really started from this perspective of we have a really precious interconnected freshwater system. So in August of 25, we put out a finite resource report looking at the increased demand for water across the Great Lakes region from industries like data centers, but also critical minerals mining and agriculture, and sort of asked ourselves, what is the cumulative impact of all of these kinds of large water using sectors coming to our region? We know that critical minerals mining, this is for things like nickel and copper that are needed inside of the chips inside of data centers, and the needs of agriculture, which is increasingly turning to irrigation, especially during the peak hot summer months, may tend to conflict with the needs of data centers and things like semiconductor chip manufacturing. And what we found is the region is somewhat unprepared to handle this influx of large water users. In addition to that, what is the cumulative effect? It necessitates both a state and a regional approach to the scope and scale of some of these issues. And then finally, a note on speed. Everything in this sector, when it comes to data centers and large water use, has been moving very, very quickly, and policymakers are trying to respond. And so, on the heels of that, just last March, we released a regional playbook for managing data center impacts. After hearing from a lot of our community-based organizations about the need for this kind of a resource, what kinds of questions should we be asking in response? And the reason why the Alliance is involved in this work at all is we have a long history of working on the Great Lakes Compact, which is an agreement between the 8 Great Lakes states, and there's a corresponding agreement with the 2 Canadian provinces. And it's primarily about managing sustainable water use. The primary thing it does is prohibit diversions of Great Lakes water out of the basin. So we're not shipping water overseas or piping it out west for those purposes. But because of that, we might see an increase in demand here in this region. But it also requires the states to manage their Great Lakes water use sustainably within the basin, to have some conservation and efficiency goals and programs, and to follow some common water use reporting protocols so that we can get a picture of Great Lakes water use throughout the region. And this phrase here at the bottom comes directly from the compact, and it says that these programs need to adjust to new demands and the potential impacts of cumulative effects in climate, which is very much the case that our publications try to make. These programs haven't really seen much adjustment since the time the compact was signed back in 2008. So I'd like to start with this map just to indicate where the data centers are located in the Great Lakes region. You can very clearly see Virginia and Data Center Alley, #1 in the country there for the data centers. But Ohio and Illinois are actually 4 and 5 in the country for the number of data centers that they have. And you can start to see this clustering effect happening around major metro areas. This is because they like to be close to things like energy transmission lines, high-speed internet, low latency, and those kinds of things. And you'll see them start to expand out into rural areas as well as they bring their own energy generation to meet their increasing power demands as well. But what's really driving a lot of this growth is hyperscale data centers. This is being built to power the needs of generative AI. And that is what necessitates this really vast data processing capabilities that only these really large scale facilities can handle. So to put it in perspective, in the Great Lakes region, this comes from the University of Virginia, Weldon Cooper Center. On average, a hyperscale data center is about 325,000 square feet, about 46 megawatts of load. That's about 1/3 the size of Millennium Park in Chicago. And when evaporative cooling is used to cool that kind of a data center, it can use between 1 and 5 million gallons a day. So to put that in perspective a little bit, over the course of a year, that's equivalent to about what 12,000 Americans use over the course of that time. We know data centers can use a variety of different cooling methods. I just mentioned evaporative cooling. This is where water is pushed through a membrane. With this method, we have a real concern about the direct consumption of water. More than 2/3 of that water evaporates off and isn't necessarily returned to the watershed. So we call that consumptive use. These other methods, liquid immersion and direct to chip, don't involve water, but are still large energy users. And then closed loop systems also may or may not involve water. They take a closed loop with water and glycol and deliver that to the server racks to bring down temperatures that way. And then finally, air cooling, which is just large fans on its own, really inefficient for the needs of AI, but could use in conjunction with a closed loop system, for example. Just to reiterate on this a little bit further, this kind of illustrates the nexus between water and energy, that as you get more water efficient, you become less energy efficient and vice versa. You can kind of see the trade-offs in the different types of cooling methods. But the real challenge that we have when it comes to data centers around water is that we really don't understand what the total water use footprint is of an individual data center. This is because unless the data center itself is withdrawing water, some of the registration and consumptive use permitting requirements that we have in the Great Lakes states don't apply. So there's no requirements to report water usage when users are hooked into municipal water systems, and over 97% of data centers are in the situation where they're connecting to public supplies. In addition to that, the literature supports that less than a third are even tracking their water usage, and there is no requirement to do so. And then again, this idea that there's a nexus between water and energy, that energy generation for those really large energy intensive types of cooling methods might also necessitate more water use. Energy generation is the largest water using sector when we zoom out and look at water usage across the Great Lakes region. And so electricity from coal or fossil fuels also requires that water, and we can't calculate how much of that is being driven specifically by data centers. And then finally, non-disclosure agreements, they're common in economic development, but here, when it comes to data centers, can obscure how much water and energy is proposed to be used at the outset, which can make demand calculations a little bit challenging. I'll take you now through the process of how a data center typically gets sited. The first thing that happens is typically economic development teams are involved in siting. And at this phase, the water managers and regional planners aren't typically being involved or consulted. And then next, the locality will be approached about land and power and water needs. Typically, those land and power needs are going to come first, and water has kind of been an afterthought. And this is where NDAs will be signed, and partners will be approached with a really short time frame to make a decision. And then the next thing that happens is things will go public, and 9 times out of 10, we are talking about a municipal water supply connection. And then finally, here at the end, we have concerns being raised by the public and legislators and water managers. And this is why I think we're really seeing a backlash towards the development of this industry, this lack of transparency from the beginning of the development process. And I have to give credit here to Freshwater, an organization in Minnesota, for some of the content here. So in addition to that, we went beyond this in the playbook and looked at some of the environmental and community impacts that data centers can have. We know that groundwater depletion can stress our surface water resources as well. It's also totally possible to outpace the natural replenishment of a particular aquifer if water isn't sustainably managed. Um, and we've seen rising electric utility rates because of and attributable to data centers. And we think there's potential for this to occur with water and wastewater as well. And I'll give an example from Ohio, where there was a particular data center cited, and that led to some water pressure drops when it was brought onto the system. And that stressed water mains at peak times, and that caused water main breaks and introduced additional contamination into the system. And so you can see how this might trickle down to ratepayers if communities aren't savvy in negotiating for some of this from the outset of these projects. Noise, air, and light pollution. When it comes to noise and air pollution, data centers have to have a backup form of power 24/7, 365, and that cannot sit idle all year long. So most often this comes in the form of diesel generators, and then just additional light pollution from these facilities. E-waste is another concern inside the data center. The server equipment is being replaced every 3 to 5 years. That could strain local landfills potentially, and there's no real clear recycling path for those materials. Fire risks is another one, especially in smaller rural areas, the potential to strain emergency services. We looked at that, and most data centers have complex fire suppression systems, but it can really trigger. There's a 2 alarm fire, for example, at a Amazon data center in Ohio. So this is a very real risk that communities should also be prepared for. But ultimately, we found this is really a low direct employment generating sector with really high resource intensive use. And most of those jobs, direct jobs that are generated, are in the construction sector. So in the playbook itself, this is just seeing a snapshot here of a community checklist, that questions that communities can ask and take to their local elected officials to say, what is your policy on data centers, and does it include evaluating these kinds of questions? Or if there's a data center proposal on the table, to ask these kinds of questions as well. And these go beyond just water, but we have some for the other environmental impacts I mentioned as well. In addition, the playbook has abilities and information about making public records requests, checklists for what to include in a community benefits agreement. These are agreements that communities can negotiate during the development process of a data center. Some examples of municipal ordinances and zoning and temporary moratoria, and then ways to participate in local hearings and meetings on proposals, including ways to come prepared and responses that you might encounter at those types of meetings. I do want to spend a little time talking about why local solutions are alone on their own are just not enough to address the scope of this challenge. And this cumulative effects infographic here really illustrates this cumulative effect of all of this increased water withdrawal. We already have a threat to groundwater integrity based on this convergence of demand. And we have existing groundwater conflicts across the Great Lakes region, parts of Southwest Michigan, parts of Wisconsin, the Central Sands region, for example, really necessitating a bigger and more comprehensive approach here. In addition, this water and energy nexus that I talked about is really difficult for a particular municipal corporation to factor in the increase of water use at a power plant that may be totally outside of their jurisdiction. So it's just difficult to factor into the 4 corners of an agreement. We know that state level economic development corporations might make decisions entirely without local input. And as local governments start to enact moratoria or restrictions, that can kind of create a patchwork and pit communities against one another, and the data center may just move to the next community over that's willing to accept it. And finally, state legislatures might respond to that as communities start to enact moratoria and restrictions. And there's an example from Ohio, House Bill 392 here, which would severely limit local and state control over data center regulation. It would require a compelling government interest and that the regulation be narrowly tailored to that interest. And that was actually enacted in Montana. Um, so our report and our playbook lay out some simple, common sense policy solutions to the scope of this problem at the state level. Number one is more planning. What you're seeing on the screen here is the Central Ohio Regional Demand Study. These kinds of studies can help inform siting, and they should consider things like what is the impact to the ecosystem, what is the impact to environmental factors as part of the demand calculations. This particular study didn't do that, but these red nodes that you're seeing illustrate communities that will be stretched for capacity by 2030, 40, and 50. These types of studies, as well as more groundwater mapping, are essential to informing more sustainable data center siting. Transparency and accountability, both in the form of upfront public disclosure and ongoing water use and energy use reporting requirements. Conservation and efficiency standards, both for water and energy that aren't siloed from one another. And then finally, eliminating or scaling back on sales and use tax incentives for this very specific industry. Throughout the last 20 years, every state in the Great Lakes region has enacted these types of incentives, and we think that it's time perhaps to pull those back. And I'll pass it off to Andrea.
Thank you so very much. Greatly appreciate that overview. And for anybody listening, please do feel free to add any questions that you have into the Q&A question button. And thanks to those who have sent along your questions today. I'm going to move forward and hand off to our colleagues at the Prairie Rivers Network. We don't do this work alone, and want to provide the opportunity for Andrew to share a bit more about what's happening in the state of Illinois, and discuss a little bit about the Power Act and what the next steps may be in the state of Illinois. Andrew?
Thanks, Andrea. And thank you to Alliance for the Great Lakes. It's been really great to work with Helena, Andrea, and the whole Alliance for the Great Lakes team as we've been working on the Power Act and other issues. So yeah, here today to talk a little bit about the Power Act. Just brief background. Prairie Rivers Network, my employer, is located in Champaign, Illinois. So we're sort of central Illinois. My favorite water body is the Mahomet Aquifer, which is Illinois' only sole source of drinking or sole source aquifer. But obviously, the Great Lakes is another waterway in Illinois that we like to protect, and we work statewide. And I have worked at Prairie Rivers for 10 years and have a master's in civil engineering. So Illinois, bring it to Illinois specifically, one thing that's really worth noting here is that we're vulnerable. We've always been thought of as a water plentiful state, and to some extent, that's still true, but we're starting to see signs of stress. This is a water map from the drought that we just left. So we just did emerge from this drought. But droughts like this are predicted to become more common as we go forward. And in the meantime, because we've had such plentiful water over the years, we really lack modern water law. We've been have not updated the ways that we regulate water. And so there's no one here to tell anybody, oh, you can't use, oh, big water user coming, you're not allowed to use that aquifer. Or can this aquifer handle another large water user? Lake Michigan is a little bit, has its own complexities because of the pact, but we don't as a state have these robust like ways to assess from a resource perspective, can the next large user join and not threaten our protection? So just laying that background for Illinois, I want to get into the Power Act and the solutions that we're proposing. So the Power Act is a state legislation, HB 5513 or SB 4106. And we kind of tackle data centers from the perspective of water, community, and energy. And when I say we, the Power Act is sort of the brainchild of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition, which is a coalition of groups in the state, including Alliance for the Great Lakes, Prairie Rivers Network, and many, many others that have worked together. Alliance is actually a new member as we've dug in on this water issue, but the coalition has worked together on climate policy for many, many years now, passing many of the largest climate policy in the state. So I'm going to dig in on the water side of the Power Act today to tell you a little bit about in detail what's going on there. I'm going to just touch on the community energy side, and then I'm just going to talk about ways that you can help. So on the water, we proposed sort of a network of organizations involved in the solution. So the data centers themselves have some requirements. We're calling on the Illinois State Water Survey, and ultimately we're proposing a permit at the Illinois EPA that is a yes or no on a data center, and I'll get into what that means. So first, what does a data center have to do according to the Power Act? So they need to produce a water resources plan. As Helena noted, these data centers have not been very transparent, and this is where we're saying, no, you've got to tell us. You got to tell us how much water you think you're going to use, where you're getting it from, where you're discharging it to, what you think is going to be in that discharge. What do you think is going to be the cost to the systems to provide you that water? That information is all put together in a plan from the data center. That gets followed up with ongoing reporting. So once the data center is in operation, or for the operating data centers, they have to tell us, here's how much water we used over multiple different months. Um, they need to look at cooling alternatives when they for a new data center. As Elena noted, cooling water is a big driver of how data centers use water. And so they look at the alternatives and produce a report that says, here's the four we looked at. Ultimately, we will require them to use one of those in the permit, but I'll get to that later. They need to produce a water scarcity drought plan. So they need to have a plan in place that says, okay, when we get to that crunch, here's what we're going to do. That means that they've done that thinking, and we'll have the agency reviewing these drought plans. They need to have fees to make sure that our agencies are being funded to do this work, and a public website where all this information is posted. So the communities that are making decisions around when a data center is going to get sited there will know very clearly information about their water that they can access online, so that this isn't happening between city council and the data center and behind a bunch of NDAs. So another key part is that this water plan goes to the Illinois State Water Survey. And if you're not familiar with the Water Survey, this is sort of an academic institution. There are experts on surface water, groundwater. They have all the data. They know, the stream data. They've got aquifer resource data. They can tell us if a data center is going to show up, what is going to be the impact on our resources? Is it going to be sustainable? What challenges might be forecasted? What animals might be struggling if a river loses some amount of base flow. So they produce a report on each data center that covers water availability, quality, ecological risks, flood risks, etc. And that report also gets posted online and becomes part of what the Illinois EPA will review. There's also a data center dashboard so that there's anybody from the public could go and sort of see some of this information online from the survey. And lastly, the Illinois EPA is going to create a water impact permit. And that the big critical moment here is that the first decision in the water impact permit is whether or not an adverse resource impact will be caused by the data center. And if the Illinois EPA thinks there's going to be an adverse water resources impact, the data center doesn't get a permit. So they're going to have to change their plan or do whatever different until the Illinois EPA looks at a plan that says, okay, we do not think there will be an adverse water resources impact. We're also requiring them to choose a cooling technology that is at least as water efficient as closed loop. We set a floor, not a ceiling, because we know this is a rapidly evolving technological space. And so they have to hit that floor, but we don't want to cap that if as technology improves, if these data centers are really going to be around for decades, we know that will improve over time. We're making sure that data centers are paying for their infrastructure costs so that we, the public, don't have to end up paying for that on our water bills. We've got water efficiency and conservation requirements that will be developed by a rulemaking process that the data centers will have to meet. And all of this, of course, goes through a public notice process with a public hearing. So that's the water side. And really, this water impact permit is our safeguard for our state's water resources. Briefly, I'll talk about communities and energy. I'm not going to go super deep here because we don't have a lot of time and we're focused on water today, but we are closing a loophole on backup air generators that mean that environmental justice, actually every community sees more air pollution right now. The loophole being closed will mean that these generators cannot run as often, and air quality and also noise will be protected in communities. We're requiring around environmental justice communities a cumulative impact assessment on the air side so that the data center doesn't cause, in addition to everything else that's happening, an undue burden. We're requiring transparent public engagement. So this is in the form of requiring community benefits agreements and banning non-disclosure agreements so that we're daylighting all the interactions between the data center and units of local government that might be recruiting a data center. And also requiring public notice on any sort of siting decision. And lastly, we create a fund that the largest data centers will have to pay into that goes into things like LIHEAP, our low-income heating program, weatherization. We've got environmental justice grant program created through a previous bill that we're directing funds towards as well. And then lastly, on the energy side, basically, we're ensuring that data centers aren't going to incur costs on our side. That's what all of this information. We create a tariff that says, okay, you guys have to pay for your transmission costs, your distribution costs. We also make sure that the capacity costs, which I don't have time to get into here, but we're ensuring that those are being paid by the data center and not by the consumer. We have a requirement called bring your own new clean capacity and energy. And that means that data centers are going to be encouraged to build new clean energy to meet that demand. And I want to highlight this is one of my favorite parts of the bill because it merges our water and our energy interests. If a data center is bringing new clean energy, all that offsite water demand that Helena talked about that will happen at a gas plant, at a coal plant, a nuclear plant, consumes a lot of water to generate energy. Well, renewables consume nothing. So if we're powering these new data centers with renewables, we're not consuming additional water. And the water use really is just the water use at the data center. So that's a quick overview of the Power Act, full detail on the water side, or on the water side. Andrea already hit this polling. Illinois supports the Power Act. 3 out of 4 Illinoisans are in support. When you break it out by water issues, we have support numbers that are really astronomically through the roof. Water infrastructure costs, data centers should pay for those. 96% of people agree. And I won't go through all these because we have limited time. But if you want to see this polling data, bit.ly/Power Act poll, you can see that information there. And I just want to invite you all, if you're fired up and excited about the Power Act, you think this matters, we're doing a lobby day in Springfield on May 30th. This is a Saturday, so we're hoping that a lot of people who can't normally come out to lobby days that we've done on a weekday can come out on May 30th to tell lawmakers that we need the Power Act. This is the last day before session ends the following day. And we think this can be like the real hammer strike to create that motivation to see all the people that are calling for the Power Act. Our target is 1,000 people. So we would love for any of you to register. We've got another bit.ly link here. You can scan the QR code. I'm sure we can put that in the chat as well. And I'm actually going to just briefly say, as both Helena and Andrea have noted, a lot is happening on the local level in Illinois across the state. And so this is happening locally everywhere. And just highlighting some big hits, Joliet approved a data center the size of Central Park. Where I live, Champaign County just approved a 1-year moratorium. And Aurora actually just resolved their 1-year moratorium with new rules that are some of the best rules in the country on data centers. So there's just a lot going on. It's a busy issue. And so I appreciate the chance to tell you all a little bit of Power Act and highlight some things happening in Illinois. Oops.
Thank you so very much, Andrew. I mean, I think what Andrew just laid out makes it really clear that this is an urgent issue. I just came back from Michigan, my home state, and Chelsea, very near where I grew up and very near where I was. There's also a very, very massive data center being proposed across the state of Michigan. And as Helena has talked about in Ohio, please click on the Power Act Lobby Day link if you want to join us. If you're in Illinois, that's going to be a really important day. As I start questions, Helena and Andrew, I want to start actually where you just stopped, Andrew, and ask both of you to lean in. Or maybe I start with Helena. But it's the issue of municipalities' engagement. Why this is such an issue. So 3 parts to it. Why is it hitting municipalities versus states? So why is the legislation why do permits have to happen at the municipal level, and what can a state do, like the Power Act, and why is it important for state-based regulations to happen and not just municipality by municipality? And the third piece of that is, why is this happening so fast? What's the urgency? Why can't things go at a slower pace? Why does it seem to be happening everywhere all at once and with such pace? So Helena, do you mind starting with that?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So I think I mean, we have three levels of government, right? And every single one of those has a role to play. I think we're seeing things happening quickly at the municipal level because they're the first that has to respond to these kinds of proposals and negotiate these kinds of agreements. And then the state level, one of the advantages and roles of the state is really to provide that more comprehensive facing approach to managing our water resources, right? Andrew talked about the adverse resource impact in the Power Act to assess whether or not a watershed can actually handle adding a new large water user. And that's something that a municipality, when negotiating the four corners of an agreement and a proposal, can't really factor into that very well in terms of what's the cumulative impact, how will this affect other large water users, maybe beyond just my local area, but in my watershed, for example. And so that's the added benefit of the state level. And we didn't talk much today about the federal level, but I think there's a role there as well in terms of funding and resources and additional research that the federal government and Congress could provide to provide more things like groundwater mapping and more data and resources there at that level as well.
Andrew, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think the regional aspect of this means that the state has a role to play. And frankly, the feds have a role to play and they're just falling down and not doing anything. So the state, Illinois, is going to step up and say, okay, well, we have shared resources that are going to affect more than just the municipality or more than just the county that's going to get this data center. And so it makes sense to have state level controls. But what I will say is, besides the banning NDAs, the Power Act doesn't take the power away from the local governments to also regulate and make their own decisions around these data centers. There's some of these additional layers here, but we're not stepping on local control in any way besides saying that you have to do it transparently. So, and that's a big deal. I think it's important for local governments that want to keep their control. They still have it with the Power Act. We're just layering on some additional protections.
Well, one of the issues, thank you so much. One of the issues that's clearly many of our listeners are identifying is how rapidly technology is changing, and that the solutions seem to be emerging in real time. And one thing I thought that maybe Helena, you could start with is just describing closed loop, what it means, what it isn't, and then maybe we could hand it off to Andrew to talk a little bit more about other technologies. And before I do that, I just wanted to say, and Helena was smart enough to highlight the federal level. Senator Durbin in the state of Illinois, in the U.S. Senate, has been working on, I think, a pretty smart piece of legislation that would increase transparency and provide more information. And I think that information and transparency is going to be really important when it comes to water use. So, Helena, why don't you start with close?
Yeah. Well, I'll preface it by saying I'm not an engineer, so this is my basic understanding of this. But I do understand the basic principles of how these different cooling methods work. And we talked about evaporative cooling, right, with the direct water usage really being the concern, that a water being evaporated off. Closed loop in a hyperscale data center takes water and glycol mix around to the server racks to bring the temperature down that way. And then that heat has to be off taken somehow. And that means either an air chiller or a liquid chiller. If they choose liquid, that means additional water consumption. If it's air, it drives additional power usage. And so with that, there's tremendous heat being generated. It's all about cooling, right? It's about bringing that temperature down so this equipment the hardware doesn't catch on fire. And so that heat has to be off taken in some kind of way. And I think what the Power Act does and what by requiring an alternatives analysis and some of these is a closer look at what's the most sustainable practice in a data center. And we can't identify what that is right at this particular moment. We lack the data because of the lack of transparency and reporting in terms of energy and water usage. And so it's really difficult in terms of that. And then to the point that technology continues to change and evolve and advance, that's true. I mean, 10 years ago, we didn't have AI, we didn't have hyperscale data centers. And so, we want to encourage and support sustainable development of this technology. And so I think it's about setting a baseline in terms of what do we know today and how can we ensure that the regulations respond to that and allow for additional efficiency improvements.
And Andrew, any insights on that?
I agree with everything Helena just said, and I'm an engineer. She's the lawyer, but she nailed it. So, but I did want to mention. I think we kind of stumbled over the previous question, the part about why are these being built so quickly. So I wanted to just briefly jump back to that. And my answer to that is generative AI has changed the name of the game. Computing power is in such high demand, and these companies that are developing AI are in a race, and they're trying to win that race. And to win, to train the best model, they have to compete for how much compute power they have. And that means that they need to have these data centers, which are their racehorses, built across, and they all need to build them. They all need to build out that capacity all at once to all run this race. And so that's why we're seeing such an immense push for this right now, and the amount of investment that's flooding in is crazy. So that's sort of the, to me, why we're seeing it now is that generative AI changed the name of the game, and there's just so much speculative investment in it. So that's my answer to that.
That's great, and thanks for catching that thread. I'm actually going to pass it back to you, Andrew, because I know you've thought a lot about this and some of the responses the Power Act has to what happens when data centers become obsolete. What is the plan around decommissioning, and what can we do to try to protect communities that might already be heavily burdened by post-industrial sites from the last industrial boom we experienced?
That's a great point, and one I'm definitely thinking a lot about. If that, depending on how that race pans out, we might have a lot of data centers that don't have something to do. Or maybe they all continue. It's hard to say. I'm not an economist, and I'm certainly not able to read a crystal ball. But decommissioning is critical. And I think that the Power Act actually doesn't really do a lot to address decommissioning. That is going to be happening at the county level. I'm actually on the Champaign County Task Force, and it's one of the top things that I want to look at. I think counties tend to be the layer at which you think about, that's kind of a siting thing. Okay, what is part of siting would be, what do you put money up for decommissioning or a bond, or what is the process for that? So I think it is really critical to think about what these do next. And when you think about the land use, you can't decommission a data center back to farmland. You can't, once you've changed it to a data center, you've dug up a lot of land, put down concrete, the topsoil's gone. Compare that to like things like renewables, where 20-year lease on a solar farm is something that can go back to farming. So that decommissioning process is really top of mind for sure.
Yeah, and I'll just also add that Power Act also requires community benefits agreements, which are a tool that local governments can use to ensure that some kind of benefits come back to the community. And that could be an appropriate place for that as well as we talked about local ordinances and things like that. Could be a way to deal with decommissioning, and negotiating for that eventuality is something that we think communities should be prepared for, right? How do you ensure and hedge against that is something that factors into the negotiation process too.
Thank you so much. And this is Chicago Water Week. And as we talked about at the top, and although we talked only briefly about it, data centers are one of many large water users. And Helene, do you want to talk a little bit about some other options, other large water users?
Yeah, I mean, so the Great Lakes region is a heavily agricultural one. I think I'll start there. And in the report, we really dived into that sector as well, because especially during those peak hot summer months, when farms and farmers are turning to irrigation for irrigating their crops, we've seen drought. Andrew started at the top with drought in Illinois. We've seen drought in Ohio as well. And so an increase there in water usage. And when it comes to agricultural water use, a lot of it is groundwater withdrawal. And those farmers and agricultural sector operators are withdrawing their own water. Therefore, they're already subject to water registration and reporting requirements, depending on the threshold of how much water they're using. So what we're trying to do, right, and what I think it's important to realize is that when water users are withdrawing their own water, they're subject to these kinds of requirements. I think what the question we're asking is, why not the same kind of assessment or analysis being applied to large water users that connect to municipal supplies? It's just not a lens that has been applied thus far, but that's what we're seeing here is a huge influx from the data center sector of large water users connecting to municipal supplies. And when it comes to supplying those facilities with water, it's not enough to be able to provide the data center with water on average. They have to be able to support the data center's peak capacity usage. And that's where these other large water users like agriculture come into play. And as well as in the finite resource report, we talked about critical minerals mining from the perspective of that additional mining might drive additional water use as well. It's a very water intensive industry, creates process mine wastewater that can never be returned or recycled, at least yet. There could be innovation there. But so these are additional, just additional large water users. And if we don't have a comprehensive way of siting data centers in addition to managing water usage, there's potential for increased conflict there, at least the way we kind of see it.
And Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit more about drought and the impact that drought is happening in prairie states like Illinois and other Great Lakes region states?
Yeah, I mean where I live was sort of the epicenter of the drought that we just left, and the moment that I'm really thoughtful about and worried about is, as Helena noted, when a drought hits, everybody's resources are strained. And a drought is typically during high heat moments, right? So cooling is at a maximum. And so everybody's saying, well, I need the water. I need to water my crops, which are wilting. I need to water my lawn, or I need to drink that water, or a data center, which has an even higher cooling burden in that moment because they're just as susceptible to the environment as our homes are, uh, is also going to need that peak demand. And so yeah, drought is a challenge. And as we've noted, we don't have the regulatory tools to have a conversation about a resource in a realistic way. And so, I think it's a real yes and moment where we need to do something about data centers now. They're here, and we need to be thinking, we need to use this moment to start thinking about what does water use in Illinois look like, and how do we share resources, ideally before we're in conflict, ideally before like water stress is everybody's top of mind 24 hours a day. It's only top of mind here in through March because we were coming out of a drought, but before it's now top of mind for a year or 2 years in a row, that is when we're not going to be able to make good decisions about how we should share our water resources and plan our water resources.
Yeah, and just to maybe bring, a horror story and as an example, I read recently about, Corpus Christi, Texas, which maybe facing, a day with no water potentially. I mean, because of several years of drought and water resource adding additional new industry and facilities without factoring in the impact of drought is another challenge when managing water resources. It's not something that can just be ignored or not planned for, and that's one of the provisions of the Power Act requiring that drought scarcity plan can help inform that longer term planning.
It's so very important. Thank you both so very much. One of the other issues that has come up in the chat is a discussion about jobs. And our region is an industrial region, some of which is agricultural, and it's evolving into a service area. But jobs is something that there are a lot of questions about. And I know you both talked briefly about it, but Helena, do you want to talk a little bit more about the front ending of jobs and how it works once they're stood up and operating?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what the research supports and University of Virginia Weldon Cooper Center has done some excellent analysis and research on this, looking at the energy and fiscal impacts of data centers. But what you'll find is they do generate employment, but it's primarily in the construction sector. These are not long-term jobs. It's not a lot of direct employment. And, there's debate about, this ancillary effect that if you build the data centers, suddenly you'll see additional economic investment. More companies will want to come because the data centers are located there. And I don't think it bears out in the research. I think that's a question that still, but broader than that, if you've maxed out all of your water resources on data centers, how will you accommodate or be able to take on that additional economic development, right? So if you have no water, if you're water stressed or water limited, your economic development, maybe future economic development growth and jobs may be limited as well.
And if I could just add, the Power Act is about making sure if we're developing data centers, we're doing it responsibly. And so that's not to say that those jobs can't come, whether it's the construction jobs or, the fewer long-term jobs. It's just to say that let's do that and protect our water. Let's do that and ensure our energy bills don't go up. And let's do that and ensure that the community is getting real benefits and being protected from some of the environmental harms, things like noise pollution that we've had some real horror stories in this state about, that the communities are then if the Power Act passes, data centers have the chance to be real community partners that we know aren't going to harm our shared resources.
I think that's important as well. We also got some questions about whether or not data centers are changing their goals? Are there fewer of them that that their production goals were larger than the amount of that are actually being stood up right now? And do you have any insights into that, and any thoughts to help individuals think about where things are today and where they're going to tomorrow, and maybe even why it's important for speaking up?
Well, yeah, I can. Okay, do you want to
Oh,
go? Just from the like, will these data centers become real? It's a real challenge, especially on the energy planning side, where we have a lot more regulatory infrastructure, and our grid operators look at all this demand coming and they plan for it. And actually, some of the cost increases that we're all seeing right now on our energy bills are due to data center speculative demand. And if they weren't speculating about those data centers, our bills would be lower. So there's sort of like an imaginary component that has a real impact on our bills. And so the that sort of, and the amount of demand coming is huge. Like, supposedly there's going to be more data centers than we're going to double our energy demand, more than double our energy demand in Illinois, as an example, with all the data centers that are coming. Are those going to be real? Maybe not. Maybe not all of them, right? And that is something that we have to grapple with when we think about planning. And on the energy side, we have all that planning. On the water side, we don't even have the planning. So we're at a real disadvantage.
yeah, and I think that's kind of key as to why it's important to think about these things now, rather than too late and too late down the road. Because you said it earlier, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict what's going to happen. We can look at the models and say this is a conservative scenario, this is a average scenario, high scenario. We don't know which one of those will become true, but we do know that we have to plan for demand now. We can do things like regional demand studies to evaluate where our water is available and where it's not. We can make better informed siting decisions for those data centers that want to come here now, so that we have water resources to spare when additional ones are built or not. But I think we have to make decisions with the best available information that we have right now. And we've seen some reports that there are companies that are scaling back or laying off employees, but we don't know if that trend will continue. And so I think we just have to work with what we've got in a way.
Thank you both. I want to also just share with folks that Senator Ron Villanova was going to be joining us today. He had a conflict with his schedule, so he's not going to be able to join us. And I'm going to use this opportunity to actually give Helena and Andrew sort of closing statements before we wrap this up. And I really want to thank everyone for all of your questions. Please know that you'll be receiving more information, and do take links. Click on the links that you see in the web chat. So Helena, do you want to have a few closing moments with a little bit more time?
Yeah, thanks. And I think it's been great to highlight this issue for Chicago Water Week, and really draw attention to the water issues associated with data centers, which I think have received less attention than some of the energy side issues in the past, but I feel like are starting to garner equal attention and kind of merit. I would just point folks, if you have any questions or you want to learn more about this subject, to our website. We have a lot of resources available there, including the report, greatlakes.org/water use, and then the playbook, greatlakes.org/data center playbook. I think the playbook is a really great resource for anyone that wants to learn more about the way in which water moves, why this cumulative effect concept that we talked about today is really important for states to manage at the state level, in cooperation with one another. And just check out those tools and resources. And if you're interested in the Power Act as well, some of those other links that we dropped in the chat today.
And I'm just going to give you one more opportunity to answer another question just popped in, and Andrea, then you can jump in and answer it as well. But it's whether or not other states and localities beyond Illinois have effective regulation of data center water management, and where else in the country beyond Illinois, for example, especially in the Great Lakes region, is there other pieces of legislation similar to the Power Act, and where do you see that going? And Helena, maybe you go first, and then Andrew, you go next.
Yeah, I'll kind of kick this off because I talked about the Great Lakes Compact earlier. And so that what that does is ensure that all of the states have some kind of comprehensive water use management program for the basin. But Illinois is a little bit unique in that scenario, and because of the history of the reversal of the Chicago River, it operates under an allocation of a Supreme Court decree in terms of how that allocation is managed. But nothing is stopping Illinois from implementing a comprehensive, groundwater management scheme, for example. Unfortunately, Illinois is a little behind the other states in that respect. It kind of lacks a comprehensive groundwater regulatory scheme. And, so that's something that we would want to see. But other states are further ahead when it comes to water management in general. And then also, when it comes to data centers, I know Minnesota has enacted some legislation recently that really specifically looks at water use by data centers. So that's an interesting state and development there. But the other states have more centralized, I would say, management of just groundwater in general. States like Ohio are a little further ahead with those regional demand studies that I mentioned and some of the groundwater mapping. I know Indiana, for example, has authorized by executive order a framework for supply, which will require evaluating these kinds of regional demand studies. But there was no funding attached to that executive order. So how that will unfold is, an outstanding question. So in terms of, what other states are doing, I don't think any states so far that I've seen have passed any other data center specific legislation other than Minnesota starting to take a closer look at that. And Minnesota has some lower thresholds for users registering their water usage just in general, just in the first place, in the first instance. So, but yeah, it's something that all of the states are grappling with, particularly Illinois and Ohio, as they have cited so many of these facilities. But even states like Wisconsin and Michigan are facing these hyperscale data center proposals at really large scale and to power generative AI.
Andrew?
Well, I'll use my last moment here to invite you all again to come down to Lobby Day. It really is, if you live in Illinois, a really important step. And I realize the Alliance has members across the state. So for those of you that don't live in Illinois, I beg a moment of your time. But there are buses coming from across the state. There's a chance to come down to see Springfield, to talk to legislators. If you haven't seen Springfield, it is the capital is stunning. It's a really great experience to be there and just kind of see how our local government works. And it's a chance to really fight for something that's important. We think the Power Act could make a big difference here, and voices all matter. So if you look at that link, there are buses coming from probably 25 different communities in the state, and one of them might be your community or not too far away. And I would really welcome you to join us. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Alliance for this opportunity to share a little bit about the Power Act and
Yeah, thank
educate
you
everyone.
so much, Andrew, and thank you, Helena, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Friendly reminder, you'll be receiving a follow-up email from this webinar today with all of the resources that we talked about, including a link to join at Lobby Day in Illinois. I also just want to thank everyone for thinking hard about this issue during Chicago Water Week. I want to thank the folks and the organizers, Chicago Water Week, for giving us the opportunity to join. Also just want to say that in a time where this kind of research and this kind of hard thinking is really important, that giving to organizations like the Alliance for the Great Lakes and Prairie Rivers is really important. And we any gifts that you're able to share with us are ones that are really important to us. But we also just want to encourage all of you to get involved, to share your content expertise like you heard today, and to join us in continuing to keep the Great Lakes healthy and vibrant for generations to come. So thank you again for joining us. And I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon.